Hello, thanks for joining me for another video in my series of church visits, this time to St Cynllo's Church, Llangoedmor. It's a bit of an oddity, with a chancel the same length as the nave and a peculiar little spire. The bottom of the walls might be medieval, but we don't really know what the church looked like in its early days, before it had an overhaul in 1830. The 1830 work involved putting in sash windows and that spire. The man responsible was David Evans of Cardigan. He seems to have seen a picture of the steeple of the 1820s St John's Church, Waterloo Road in London and been highly taken with it, so much that he thought Llangoedmor should have the same sort of steeple. Unfortunately, Llangoedmor Church didn't have a tower and is considerably smaller than the London church, but that was no problem to Mr Evans. He simply made a miniature version in the local Kilgarran stone and stuck it up there between the chancel and the nave. When William North, a somewhat eccentric man who wrote poetry in 7 languages and was later Archdeacon of Cardigan, became rector here in 1845, he started to improve the church. He put in a stained glass window, still a bit of a novelty then, by Messrs Griffiths. I don't know anything about them, and the window has gone. His next improvement scheme was more extensive. He planned a modernisation, and he called in a London architect already responsible for several local churches, Robert Jewell Withers. Withers' usual thing was to retain as much wall as possible, raise the roof line and create from a Georgian box-like church a correctly proportioned nave and chancel with plate tracery windows, resulting in what was called at the time a correct pointed church. He must have been disappointed when he saw what he had to work with here. I'm sure he laughed at the ridiculous spire and shook his head at the sash windows, 3-decker pulpit and box pews. They would all have to go, but the long chancel could be remodelled and worked with. Unfortunately for Mr Withers, he wasn't going to get his own way. No, the spire was much loved, it had to stay, and the roof was fine as it was, although draughty. He was told to cover it up with boarding and leave it low. Withers must have thought twice about this job, but a contract is a contract, and he was not long into his career and had a wife and several children to support. He was also busy down the road working on Cardigan Guildhall, so he took the job. So let's go inside and see what Mr Withers did. He reworked the porch and added a vestry, which has one of his excellent Gothic chimneys. An odd neighbour, though, for that classical spire. He cleared the gentry's box pews out, not altogether a popular move with them, I bet, and replaced them with benches, including plenty for the poor of the parish, and in so doing decluttered the chancel, where he also replaced the 3-sided Laudian footplace with a raised altar and a straight communion rail with his trademark geometrical shapes cut out of the panels. His east window has another of Withers' favourite devices, the Star of David, above each lancet, shorter and wider lancets than he would normally design, but all the low roof would accommodate. This was glazed by Lavers and Barrowed, his stained glass firm of choice, who produced 14th century style windows that perfectly complemented his tracery. Withers tiled the chancel with cheap tiles, using better ones to make the reredos, something he did when there wasn't much money to spend on a project. I don't know what the budget was for this church, but it wasn't much by the look of things. He replaced the 3-decker pulpit, which had been on the north wall, with a wooden one on the south side of the chancel arch. That in turn was replaced in 1903 by a more elaborate stone one, given in memory of Archdeacon North, who preached a long sermon in English and Welsh. His services here lasted a full 2 hours. Withers also reworked the chancel arch with a seat and reading desk for the priest, so he wasn't lost somewhere down the long chancel. He repositioned the font too, and gave it a new base and cover. That's not all he did with it, though. It's a Norman font, and would have had that charming irregularity of such ancient fonts, but this wouldn't have pleased Withers. A man who was so keen on geometry probably found its less than perfect symmetry irritating, and on top of that he may have been annoyed to be told it had to stay and not replaced by a nice new one designed by him. It was retooled to tidy it up a bit. The only other old elements of the church that survived, a leaded window and a stoop. The builder who won the contract to do the necessary construction reportedly sold to defray his costs. They were bought by a Mr. Thomas and taken to St. Mary's, Cardigan. The leaded window might have been the 1845 one or something older. Much though this kind of lack of preservation might horrify us now, this sort of thing went on a lot at that period. Looking beyond the remodelling of the church now, there is a Lloyd of Coedmor mansion hatchment, and there are quite a lot of monuments on the walls, none exceptional, but they are typical of what you find in this area. There's a muddle of a monument to Evan Davis of Trevorgan, later the home of Archdeacon North, which is partly classical and partly a bit Gothic. And conventionally classical ones, such as this lovely kneeling woman. And there's also a military-themed one to H.M. Vaughan, who died in the Crimean War. He fell at the head of his company. His father had commanded the same regiment. Later, Lieutenant Colonel G.E. Lloyd fell gallantly when leading his regiment in the Boer War. His monument gives us a long list of his military service and awards. He served not only in South Africa but also in Afghanistan and Egypt. Llangoedmor Church is a bit peculiar with its odd proportions, and I think R.J. Withers wouldn't rank it amongst his best work, but it is Grade 2 star listed for the near-complete Victorian fittings by Withers, and, though it might have surprised that architect to learn, for its bizarre but rather fun spire. If you fancy visiting, it's open daily. I hope you found the tour interesting, and as always, thank you for watching.